There was a time when the most powerful men in the world were driven in Packards. Franklin Roosevelt rode in one. Stalin received one as a gift and ordered copies, made for Soviet industry. The Pope was chauffeured in one. Packard automobiles were present at the signing of treaties, the ends of wars, and the openings of buildings whose names are still on maps. At its peak, the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit occupied 35 acres of factory floor, employed 10,000 workers, and produced the most technically sophisticated luxury automobile manufactured anywhere on Earth. Then it made a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable and together proved fatal. On July 25, 1958, the last Packard rolled off an assembly line in South Bend, Indiana. It was a Studebaker with a Packard badge. This is the story of how America's greatest luxury car became a nameplate on someone else's automobile. The founders, James Ward Packard, was an electrical engineer from Warren, Ohio, who purchased one of Alexander Winton's automobiles in 1898 and found it mechanically unsatisfactory. He wrote to Winton with his suggestions for improvement. Winton's reply, as legend records it, was direct. If Mr. Packard believed he understood automobiles so well, he was welcome to build one himself. Packard did. In 1899, he and his brother William founded the Ohio Automobile Company in Warren, Ohio, with engineer George Weiss and a capitalization modest enough to require that James Packard himself work on the production floor. The first Packard automobile, designated Model A, was completed on November 6, 1899. It had one cylinder, 3 forward speeds, and a steering tiller rather than a wheel. By 1903, the company had relocated to Detroit, renamed itself the Packard Motor Car Company, and hired a young engineer named Henry Joy as its president. Joy brought capital, connections, and a conviction that Packard should not compete on price. It should compete on excellence. That conviction would define the company for the next 40 years. It would also, in the end, destroy it. The early excellence, Henry Joy's presidency, transformed Packard from a promising Ohio startup into the definitional American luxury automobile. The move to Detroit in 1903 placed the company at the center of the emerging automotive industry. The construction of a new factory on East Grand Boulevard, designed by architect Albert Kahn and completed in 1911, gave Packard a manufacturing facility that was, at its opening, the most advanced automobile plant in the world. The cars themselves set standards that competitors spent decades attempting to match. The Packard Model L of 1904 introduced a steering wheel to replace the tiller, an innovation Packard was among the first American manufacturers to standardize. The 1916 Twin Six, a 12-cylinder engine producing 88 horsepower, was the first production V12 automobile in American history. Engineers at Cadillac, Lincoln, and Pierce Arrow studied it and responded with their own 12-cylinder programs. By 1915, Packard had established a market position that appeared unassailable. The name carried a specific cultural weight that advertising could not manufacture and competitors could not replicate. Ask the man who owns one. The tagline was not created until 1902. It was still being used 40 years later because no better description of Packard's appeal had been found. The Great War and the Liberty Engine, the First World War, transformed Packard from a luxury automobile manufacturer into a strategic military asset, and the transformation revealed an engineering capability that the civilian market had never fully tested. In 1916, the United States government approached Packard to develop a high-performance aircraft engine for the coming war. The result was the Liberty L-12, a 400 horsepower, water-cooled V12 engine designed in a single 6-day session by Packard engineers Jesse Vincent and Hall Scott's Elbert Hall in a Washington, D.C. hotel room in May 1917. The Liberty engine powered Allied aircraft, PT boats, and tanks. Packard manufactured 6,500 Liberty engines during the war alongside its automobile production. The engineering achievement was recognized internationally. The Liberty became the standard against which military aircraft engines were measured for a decade after the armistice. The war years also demonstrated something that would matter enormously in 1941. Packard could shift its entire manufacturing operation to military production with a speed and precision that most industrial firms could not match. The factory on East Grand Boulevard was not merely a car plant. It was a precision manufacturing system that happened in peacetime to make automobiles, the Golden Age. The decade following the First World War was the period in which Packard became something beyond an automobile company. It became an American institution. The 8, introduced in 1923, established the straight 8-engine configuration as the standard of American luxury motoring. The 12, reintroduced in 1932 as the Twin Six's successor, produced 160 horsepower from a 7.3-liter engine at a time when most American automobiles produced fewer than 80. Packard's clientele in the 1920s and 1930s read as a catalog of American achievement. Ernest Hemingway owned one. Al Capone armored one. The United States government used them as presidential transport. 17 of the 22 Allied and Axis heads of state who attended the 1919 Paris Peace Conference had arrived in Packards. The car was present wherever power was exercised and wealth was displayed. The East Grand Boulevard factory, at its 1937 peak, employed 10,000 workers and occupied 35 acres of floor space across 40 interconnected buildings. Annual production reached 109,518 cars in 1937. The Packard name, measured by the cultural authority it carried, was worth more than any balance sheet could capture. The fatal compromise. In 1935, Packard made a decision that its engineers opposed, its dealers supported, and its historians have debated ever since. Facing declining sales during the Depression and pressure from a board that believed the luxury market alone could not sustain the company's scale, Packard introduced the 120, a mid-priced automobile, retailing at $990, designed to compete with Buick and Oldsmobile rather than Cadillac and Lincoln. The 120 was a sound automobile. It was also a category error of the first order. Packard's value as a luxury brand resided entirely in its exclusivity in the understood social meaning of Packard ownership as the marker of arrival at a specific level of American success. A Packard that a mid-level insurance salesman could afford was not the same Packard that Franklin Roosevelt rode in. Even if the engineering was excellent, sales climbed. In 1937, the 120 and its successor, the 110, accounted for more than 75% of Packard's total production. The factory was full. The balance sheet was healthy. The brand was being spent. Nobody in the boardroom used that word, but the spending had begun, and it would not stop. The last Packards, the 1955 and 1956 Packards, were the last automobiles that carried the name with any engineering justification. They introduced a new V8 engine, a torsion bar suspension system that contemporary road tests praised as the finest ride in American automotive production, and a body design that was handsome by the standards of the era. They were also built in a Detroit factory operating on borrowed time. with a company that was consuming its financial reserves faster than its sales could replenish them. In 1957, production moved entirely to South Bend. The new Packard was a Studebaker President with a revised grille, additional trim, and a Packard badge on the hood. Packard dealers, many of whom had represented the mark for decades, received the 1957 model and began closing their doors. A brand promise is a contract. The 1957 Packard was a breach of contract delivered in a showroom. The final Packard was produced on July 25, 1958. Total production for the model year: 2,622 cars. In 1937, Packard had produced 109,518. The factory that had built Merlin engines and Liberty engines and the finest luxury automobiles in America fell silent. It had taken precisely 23 years from the introduction of the 120 to the end of the line. The factory. The Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit, 35 acres, 40 interconnected buildings, designed by Albert Kahn and opened in 1911, was sold after the company's collapse to a series of subsequent owners who operated portions of it for light manufacturing and warehousing through the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1970s, the complex had been largely abandoned. By the 1990s, it had become the most photographed symbol of Detroit's industrial decline. A vast ruin of broken glass, collapsed roofwork, and paint-peeled concrete that photographers from around the world traveled to document. The plant was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. The designation carried no funding for preservation and no mechanism for restoration. A developer purchased the complex in 2013 for $405,000, approximately $11.57 per square foot, for one of the most significant industrial buildings in American automotive history, and announced plans for redevelopment that remained largely unrealized through the following decade. The building stands. The roof has collapsed in sections. The floors are littered with debris that includes, in places, components and tooling from the cars that were made there. The precision that built Merlin engines is visible in the bones of the structure. Everything else has been reclaimed by weather, time, and the particular silence of a building that once ran 3 shifts and now runs none. Epilogue. The Packard name has been revived, proposed, and speculated over in the decades since 1958 with a regularity that measures the distance between brand equity and operational reality. General Motors acquired the rights to the Packard name and has held them through successor entities without deploying them. A series of independent investors have announced Packard revival projects at intervals of roughly a decade in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and none have produced an automobile. The collectors who preserve original Packards maintain a market that assigns significant value to the senior models of the 1930s and early 1940s. A 1934 Packard 12 in original condition sells at auction for $200,000 to $400,000, depending on configuration. A 1940 Super 8 Custom in coach-built form has sold for more than $1 million. The cars the company built when it understood what it was are worth more today than they were when new. The 120 that began the dilution retails at collector auctions for $15,000 to $25,000, a respectable sum for a pre-war automobile and a precise financial expression of what the decision to make it cost the company that made it. Ask the man who owns one. He will tell you what a Packard was. Nobody living can tell you what could have remained. A luxury brand is not a product. It is a promise made consistently over time. The first compromise does not break the promise. It simply makes the second compromise easier to justify. The man who can afford everything chooses what he buys for reasons that have nothing to do with price. When you give him a reason to choose something else, he chooses something else. He does not come back. Packard built the engines that helped win 2 world wars and never found a way to convert that achievement into post-war market share. Excellence in the service of others does not automatically translate into excellence in the service of yourself. The factory on East Grand Boulevard was designed to last a century. The brand decision, made in 1935, gave it 23 years. Buildings are more forgiving than markets. Markets remember everything.